The first thing I registered was the sound, a sickeningly intimate crack that seemed to emanate from the very core of my being. It wasn't loud, not like a gunshot, but it was deep and final, the sound of something essential giving way. Time warped, stretching into a syrupy slow-motion ballet of my own destruction. My arms flailed useless windmills against the indifferent blue sky of Lake Arrowhead. The placid California sun glinted off the water, a mocking witness to my fall. My trajectory was all wrong. Instead of the forgiving splash of the lake, my body was hurtling sideways, drawn by a cruel, unseen gravity toward the one solid, unyielding point in this picturesque scene, the concrete foundation anchoring the dock to the shore. The impact was a brutal, all-encompassing explosion of sensation. My right hip and shoulder slammed into the raised concrete edge with a force that stole the air from my lungs and replaced it with white-hot agony. The crack I had heard echoed through my bones as a wave of pure, unadulterated pain crashed over me. My head snapped back from the momentum, connecting with the hard edge with a horrifying thud. A kaleidoscope of black and silver stars erupted behind my eyelids. I crumpled, a marionette with its strings cut, sliding limply to where the water lapped against the shore, half submerged in the cool lake, my body a geography of torment I couldn't begin to map. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't breathe. My diaphragm was paralyzed, locked in a spasm of shock and pain. When my lungs finally desperately sucked in air, it brought a surge of nausea, so violent I thought I would be sick right there in the shallows. The world tilted and spun. A searing fire radiated from my lower back, sending tendrils of agony snaking down my legs and up my spine. A rhythmic, blinding throb began to pulse in my head, and I could feel something warm and sticky trickling down my temple. Through the fog of pain, sounds began to filter in, distorted and distant. The light-hearted laughter of my cousins Mark and Sophie curdled into confused shouts. I heard a high-pitched scream which I dimly recognized as belonging to Ethan's new girlfriend, Chloe. Then the sound of splashing footsteps. But the clearest sound of all, the one that cut through the physical agony with a blade of pure emotional betrayal, was my brother Ethan's voice. He insisted it was just a joke, that he had barely touched me. My life had been a long, exhausting campaign for validation from a family that viewed my existence as an afterthought. Growing up in the Wallace household in the affluent suburbs of Philadelphia was to understand from a very early age the unspoken hierarchy. My father Robert, a titan of corporate law with a frown etched permanently onto his face, had always regarded me with an air of mild disappointment. I was not the son he could boast about on the golf course. I was the artistic, sensitive daughter whose pursuits he deemed frivolous. My mother, Catherine, was a master of appearances, a real estate mogul who sold not just homes but lifestyles, and whose primary maternal function was to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, compare me unfavorably to everyone else's children. And then there was Ethan. 3 years my senior, the undisputed son around which our family universe orbited. Ethan was the golden child, the star quarterback who filled our home with trophies and the promise of a brilliant future. His academic performance was mediocre at best, but it was excused by his athletic prowess. Family dinners were monologues dedicated to his latest touchdown. His scholarship offers his boundless potential. My achievements in art, and later my successful career as a graphic designer in San Francisco, were treated as cute hobbies. They were footnotes in the grand narrative of Ethan's success. Our childhood home was a physical manifestation of this disparity. Ethan's room was a shrine to his athletic glory, filled with medals, signed footballs, and expensive equipment our parents spared no expense to provide. My room was functional, a place to sleep. My requests for professional-grade art supplies were met with lectures about budgeting, despite my father's salary affording us a lifestyle that was the envy of our neighborhood. The dynamic was set early. Ethan's favorite pastime was what he called pranks, and what I experienced as a systematic campaign of torment. When I was 7, he tripped me as I carried a glass of milk down our polished hardwood staircase. I tumbled down 8 steps, the glass shattering, milk and blood mixing on the floor. I ended up with a sprained wrist. My parents' verdict was that boys will be boys. When I was 10, he locked me in the dark, musty storage closet in the basement for 3 hours while our parents were out. They returned to find me hysterical, clawing at the door. Ethan laughed it off as a game of hide-and-seek gone wrong, and somehow I was the one reprimanded for overreacting. Physical pain became a currency I was expected to accept in silence. A baseball thrown accidentally into my back left a bruise the size of a grapefruit. My father told me to toughen up. A playful shove off my bike tore my knee open on the gravel. My mother was more concerned about the blood stain on my new jeans than the wound beneath. The pattern was immutable. Ethan hurt me. I expressed pain. I was blamed for disrupting the family's fragile peace. My protests were met with eye rolls and accusations of being dramatic. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to internalize it all. I began to question my own reality. Was I really as oversensitive as they claimed? Was the pain truly as bad as it felt? This corrosive self-doubt became my constant companion, a ghost that followed me into adulthood, making me apologize for my own feelings, my own needs. Moving to San Francisco after college was my salvation. The physical distance was a balm, allowing me to build a life on my own terms. I excelled in my career, landing a senior position at a prestigious design agency. I built a network of friends who saw me, who valued me. This success gave me the financial independence and the confidence to start erecting boundaries with my family. Visits home were limited to major holidays, the interactions brief and heavily managed. This annual trip to the lake house was a tradition my parents had started 5 years ago. The sprawling cedar cabin with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Lake Arrowhead should have been a paradise. For me, it was always a gilded cage. I approached each visit with a toxic cocktail of dread and a stubborn, childlike hope that this time would be different. This would be the year they would finally see me as an adult, as an equal. This year, I had a valid excuse to decline. A major project at work was reaching its deadline. But some masochistic part of me, that desperate inner child still craving their approval, pushed me to go. So I boarded the plane, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach with each passing mile. The first day had followed the usual script. My mother greeted me with a clinical once-over, remarking that I looked tired and could use some highlights in my hair. My father offered a distracted hello, his attention fixed on the financial news. Ethan was already holding court on the dock with Chloe, the personal trainer with a permanent smile, who had no idea what kind of viper's nest she had stepped into. Dinner was a showcase of my father's business acumen and Ethan's latest anecdotes, punctuated by his thinly veiled insults disguised as harmless teasing at my expense. I smiled through it, a silent mantra playing in my head. 7 days. I can survive for 7 days. Saturday had started with a deceptive calm. With Ethan sleeping in, the atmosphere was almost pleasant. My father even asked a coherent question about one of my clients. My mother and I had a surprisingly normal conversation while walking along the shore. That fragile peace shattered the moment Ethan emerged for lunch, irritable and spoiling for a fight. He immediately launched into a critique of my new haircut, telling me I looked like I was trying to be 20 again, and that it was time to adopt a more mature style. My father chuckled, which only fueled Ethan's cruelty. He then mocked my leather sandals, asking loudly if I was planning on going on a jungle safari later. Chloe, to her credit, looked mortified. She quietly offered that she thought my sandals were cute, which earned her a sharp look from Ethan. He told her she didn't have to defend me, that I knew he was just kidding around. He claimed we had always been like this. I forced a smile and changed the subject, the familiar tension coiling in my gut. My mother's earlier warmth had vanished, replaced by a cool distance, as if she was already siding with him in a conflict that had barely begun. I retreated to the dock that afternoon with a book, seeking solace. I found a quiet corner, and for 20 blissful minutes I was alone. Then I heard his heavy, arrogant footsteps approaching. He and his friends descended upon the dock like a conquering army. My hope for a peaceful afternoon evaporated when Ethan cannonballed into the water just feet from my chair, drenching me in my novel. He offered a completely insincere apology, remarking that it was a lake and people tended to swim in it. I kept my voice neutral, stating that I was just reading and there was plenty of room for everyone. He pulled himself onto the dock, his muscular frame dripping water, using his physicality to dominate the space just as he had since childhood. He announced loudly to the others that I was so predictable, always the boring one reading at a lake house. I ignored him, my eyes fixed on the page, though the words had become a meaningless blur. The game they played, diving for weighted rings, crept closer and closer to my chair. When a ring landed squarely in my lap, I knew it was intentional. I handed it back without a word, my non-reaction clearly infuriating him. He taunted me, asking why I wouldn't join them or if I was afraid of getting my hair wet, always so concerned with my appearance. That was the last straw. I gathered my things, announcing that I was heading back to the house. As I stood, he blocked my path. He told me to ask nicely, to be let past a familiar taunt from our childhood. The game had stopped. Everyone was watching. I felt a hot flush of humiliation, a phantom of the powerless 8-year-old he had so enjoyed tormenting. I finally forced out the words, hating the tremor in my voice, and asked him to please move. He stepped aside with an exaggerated, mocking bow. I had almost reached the end of the dock when he called out again, claiming I had forgotten something. I turned instinctively, a fatal mistake. He was holding my sunglasses, which must have fallen from my bag. He grinned and then tossed them towards me deliberately high and wide. I lunged to catch them, the momentum carrying me sideways. I regained my balance, my heart pounding with frustration and anger. I told him loud enough for everyone to hear to grow up. His expression darkened. I should have recognized the dangerous glint in his eyes, the same look that preceded his worst childhood cruelties. But I was done. I turned my back on him and started walking towards the shore, thinking it was over. I didn't hear him follow me over the creak of the wooden planks. I was just 3 steps from safety when I felt his presence directly behind me, his breath hot on my neck. He said in a deceptively light voice that my problem was I had always thought I was better than everyone else. And then he shoved me. Now lying half in the water, the world swam back into a brutally sharp focus. Lily was cradling my head, telling me not to move. My parents came running from the house. My father, a beer still in his hand, surveyed the scene with an expression of pure annoyance. He demanded to know what was going on, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, not once landing on me. Ethan immediately began his defense, claiming we were just messing around and that I had tripped. He added that I had always been clumsy. My mother knelt beside me, her face a mask of embarrassment, not concern. She hissed my name, asking what had happened. Through a wave of pain, I gasped out the truth. I told her Ethan had pushed me, that I had hit the concrete, that my back and my head were hurt. She glanced at Ethan, who was already shaking his head, insisting he was just kidding and that I had just fallen weirdly. My father finally stepped closer, his gaze hardening as he took in my crumpled form. He growled the words that had been the soundtrack to my childhood injuries. "Walk it off. You're fine." Ethan, emboldened, addressed Chloe and our cousins, sharing an insider secret about me. He claimed I always did this for sympathy. The betrayal was a physical blow, nearly as painful as the impact with the concrete. My mother stood, brushing sand from her pristine linen pants. She sighed, saying that I would do anything to ruin a peaceful weekend. She announced that dinner would be in an hour once I was done with my display. Tears of pain and humiliation streamed down my face. I whispered, pleading for help, insisting that something was really wrong. No one moved. Finally, Lily, bless her, broke ranks. She announced she would help me to my room. The journey from the dock to the house was an odyssey of agony. Each step sent shards of glass shooting through my spine. By the time my cousins helped me onto my bed, I was drenched in sweat and dizzy with pain. Lily left me with painkillers and a glass of water, but I was conditioned by years of dismissal to downplay my own suffering. I declined her offer to call a doctor. Alone, I curled into a fetal position, the only posture that offered a sliver of relief. From downstairs, the sounds of a normal family vacation continued, the clinking of dishes, laughter from the deck, music from the expensive sound system. I was a ghost in my own family, an inconvenience to be ignored. Night fell. I lay awake, trapped in a body that had become a prison of pain. The headache intensified into a relentless pounding drum against my skull. More terrifyingly, a strange numbness began to creep into my toes. When I tried to wiggle them, the response was sluggish and weak. A cold, sharp fear began to cut through the pain. Something was dangerously, catastrophically wrong. But the thought of confronting my family again, of facing their accusations and eye rolls, was paralyzing. So I suffered in silence, watching the hours tick by on the digital clock, each minute an eternity. By morning, the numbness had spread up my right leg while my left buzzed with 1,000 needles. When I tried to sit up, the room spun so violently I collapsed back against the pillows. Around 9 a.m., my mother finally opened my door. Without even entering, she announced that they were all going hiking and asked if I would be joining them or if I was still not feeling well. Her casual cruelty broke something inside me. My voice sounded strange, thick, and slurred as I told her I thought I needed a doctor. I tried to explain that I couldn't feel my legs properly. She sighed dramatically, accusing me of taking this too far and ruining everyone's time with my behavior. I insisted I wasn't making it up, but the words came out garbled. She replied firmly that my father said I was fine, and that I would feel better if I just got up and stopped wallowing. Then she closed the door, leaving me alone in my escalating terror. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. My fingers felt like clumsy sausages. The screen was a blurry mess, but I somehow navigated to my recent calls and pressed Jenna's name. When her cheerful voice came through, I almost wept. She asked how the family vacation from hell was going. I tried to answer, but all I could manage was a garbled sound, a desperate slur of her name. Her tone shifted instantly from cheerful to alarmed. She asked what was wrong, why I sounded so strange. I forced the words out one by one, a Herculean effort of will. I told her I was hurt, that Ethan had pushed me, that I had hit my head and my back. I told her I couldn't feel my legs and that no one believed me. I heard the sound of keys jingling on her end of the line. Her voice became sharp, authoritative. She told me I needed an ambulance right now, that those were serious symptoms. She was calling emergency services. She stayed on the line, her calm, commanding voice a lifeline in the encroaching darkness. She told me the paramedics were on their way about 15 minutes out. She urged me to stay awake to keep talking. But the phone felt impossibly heavy. Her voice began to fade as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. The last thing I remember before the darkness swallowed me whole was a sound I had been praying to hear, a sound that signaled both my rescue and the beginning of my retribution. Faintly in the distance, I heard the wail of approaching sirens. The real world was coming, and my family's carefully constructed narrative was about to be shattered forever. The sirens were a distant scream at first, a sound that pierced the thick cotton wool stuffing my ears. Then they grew louder, a crescendo of righteous fury tearing through the tranquil afternoon air of Lake Arrowhead. For my family, it was the sound of an unwelcome intrusion, a disruption to their carefully curated vacation. For me, it was the cavalry. It was the sound of a truth I had been screaming into a void for 28 years finally being answered. Through the rapidly narrowing tunnels of my vision, I saw the chaos unfold. My bedroom door, which my mother had so dismissively closed just an hour before, was thrown open. The figures that filled the doorway were not family. They were strangers in dark blue uniforms, their movements imbued with an urgency and professionalism that was utterly alien to this house. Their voices were calm but firm, a staccato of questions and commands that cut through my father's blustering attempts to control the situation. I felt hands on me, gentle but efficient, checking my pulse, shining a bright, painful light into my eyes. Words floated above me, a clinical vocabulary that was a world away from dramatic and oversensitive. I heard phrases like unresponsive, dilated pupils, and suspected spinal trauma. A cervical collar was expertly fitted around my neck, immobilizing my head with a reassuring firmness. As they prepared to move me, I caught glimpses of my family huddled in the hallway, their faces a bizarre tableau of shock and indignation. My mother, pale and clutching her pearls, looked as if the paramedics were tracking mud on her pristine carpets. My father's face was a thundercloud of disbelief, his authority completely usurped. Ethan hung back a shadow in the doorway, his usual bravado replaced by a look of dawning fear. The lead paramedic, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, fired questions at my parents that they struggled to answer. She asked when this had happened, and my father mumbled something about the previous afternoon. She asked what exactly had occurred, and my mother vaguely mentioned that I had fallen against the dock. The paramedic's eyes narrowed slightly. She asked if I had been conscious the whole time, and they answered yes, that I had been talking earlier. Her final question seemed to hang in the air, thick with unspoken judgment. She asked if I had complained of any specific symptoms. My mother admitted I had said I was in pain. The paramedic then asked if anyone had monitored me through the night. A guilty silence was their answer. As they began to lift me onto a backboard, I heard my father's desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. He was telling the paramedics that I was just being dramatic, that I had always been sensitive. The male paramedic, busy securing straps across my body, replied without looking up. His voice was cold, professional steel. He said that these were objective neurological symptoms and there was nothing dramatic about them. Just before they carried me out, I heard Ethan's voice, high and defensive, insisting to anyone who would listen that it was just a joke, that he didn't mean to hurt me. The lead paramedic paused, her sharp gaze pinning him to the spot. She stated, not as a question but as a fact, that this was no accident, that someone had pushed me. There was a stunned silence, broken by my mother's frantic clarification that it was just siblings playing around a terrible accident. The paramedic's response was crisp and chilling. She looked my mother dead in the eye and told her she had better call a lawyer. She said this was now a potential assault case with serious bodily injury. The ambulance doors closed on their shocked, horrified faces. As the vehicle lurched into motion, the siren now a deafening roar, I felt myself finally surrendering to the encroaching darkness. My last conscious thought was that for the first time in my life someone had believed me, and it had taken near death to make it happen. Waking up was a slow, agonizing process. It began not with sight or sound, but with a smell, a sharp antiseptic scent that was the antithesis of the pine-scented air at the lake. Then came the beeping, a rhythmic, metronomic pulse that seemed to be counting down the seconds of my new reality. Opening my eyes felt like lifting lead weights. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room sent daggers of pain into my skull, and I squeezed them shut again. I was disoriented, my thoughts swimming in a thick fog. Where was I? what had happened, I was aware of a profound wrongness, a disconnection from my own body. An uncomfortable tube snaked down my throat, and I could feel the pull of wires and IV lines attached to my arms. Panic began to bubble in my chest until a calm voice cut through the confusion. A woman introduced herself as Dr. Chen. She told me I was in the hospital, that I was safe, and that I should try not to fight the breathing tube that was helping me. I forced my eyes open again, more carefully this time. Doctor. Chen stood beside my bed, her expression a mixture of kindness and grave seriousness. She explained that I had been unconscious for nearly 36 hours. The process of removing the breathing tube was deeply unpleasant, but once it was out, my mind began to clear. Memories returned in jagged fragments. Ethan's smirk, the brutal impact, the cold water, my mother's dismissive voice, the paramedics, the siren, doctor. Chen pulled up a chair and began to explain the full extent of my injuries, her voice gentle but unwavering. She told me I had been brought in with a severe traumatic brain injury and spinal trauma. She explained that they had to perform emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on my brain from intracranial bleeding. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Surgery, bleeding in my brain. Then came the next blow. She told me I also had fractures in my thoracic spine, specifically at the T11 and T12 vertebrae. My mind struggled to process the clinical terms. All I could manage to whisper, my voice a raw, hoarse croak, was a question about my legs. Dr. Chen's expression remained carefully neutral. She explained that there was significant swelling around my spinal cord, which was causing the numbness and weakness. She said that until the swelling went down, they wouldn't know the full extent of the neurological damage. She then looked at me, her gaze direct and full of meaning, and added that I had arrived just in time. If treatment had been delayed much longer, she said the damage could have been permanent or even fatal. The weight of that statement settled over me like a shroud. I had been hours away from death or a life of complete paralysis, all while my family debated whether I was being dramatic. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down my temple. But it was what Dr. Chen said next that truly fractured my world. Her tone shifted slightly, becoming even more careful. She mentioned that the MRI, a marvel of modern medicine that could see the secrets hidden within the body, had also shown evidence of several previously healed fractures. She specified my ribs and my left wrist, noting that they appeared to be from different incidents over a period of years. The hospital room seemed to recede. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor faded into a dull hum. In its place, a slideshow of my own history began to play in my mind, each image sharp and excruciatingly clear. Healed fractures in your ribs. Suddenly, I was 12 years old again, standing in our backyard in Philadelphia. The sun was warm on my skin. Ethan was practicing his pitching for an upcoming baseball game. I was reading a book on the patio. He called my name and I looked up just as he whipped the ball towards me, not at the net, but directly at my chest. It struck me with the force of a battering ram, knocking me backward off the chair. The pain was blinding, a galaxy of fire exploding in my side. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only lie on the flagstones, gasping like a fish out of water. When my father came running out, Ethan was already spinning his story. He claimed his hand had slipped, that it was a total accident. I tried to tell them he had looked right at me, that he had done it on purpose. My father clapped Ethan on the shoulder and told me to stop making a big deal out of nothing. He told me to walk it off. The pain in my side lasted for weeks. I learned to breathe shallowly, to move carefully, to never mention it again. A secret kept by my own body. An old greenstick fracture in your left wrist. The memory shifted and I was 7. I was walking carefully down our grand wooden staircase, proud of my new dress for a family party. Ethan came thundering down behind me. He jokingly lunged at me and his foot caught mine. I tumbled, my small body cartwheeling down the polished steps. I instinctively put my arm out to break my fall, and a sharp cracking pain shot up to my elbow. My mother rushed over, her first concern being whether I had torn my new dress. My father sighed, annoyed at the commotion. Ethan claimed I was clumsy, that I had just tripped over my own feet. When the doctor at the urgent care clinic put the cast on my arm, my parents told him I was a tomboy, always getting into scrapes. They constructed a narrative that erased Ethan's cruelty and painted me as the source of my own misfortune. Dr. Chen was watching my face, her expression one of deep professional concern. She said gently that the pattern of injuries they were seeing was concerning both the current trauma and the historical evidence. She informed me that a hospital social worker, a Miss Davis, would like to speak with me when I felt up to it. I could only nod, the small movement sending a fresh bolt of pain through my skull. Before we could speak further, a commotion erupted in the hallway. I recognized the loud, entitled tones of my parents demanding to see me, demanding information about my condition. Dr. Chen stood her posture resolute. She told me she would speak with them and asked if I wanted them to come in. The thought of facing them sent a spike of pure adrenaline-fueled fear through me, but I knew it was a confrontation that had to happen. I was no longer the little girl who could be told to walk it off. The evidence was not just in my memory. It was on a black and white MRI scan. I whispered that they could come in, but only one or two at a time. My mother entered first, my father trailing behind her. They stopped a few feet from the bed, looking awkward and uncertain, as if they didn't know how to approach this broken, bandaged version of their daughter. My mother looked haggard, her perfect composure finally cracked. My father seemed smaller, his usual confident bluster replaced by a hesitant slump. My mother breathed my name, her eyes wide as they took in the monitors, the IV lines, the bandage on my head. She said they had no idea. The simplicity of that statement, the sheer staggering blindness of it, was breathtaking. They had never known because they had never looked. They had never seen my pain because they had refused to believe it was real. My father cleared his throat, stating, as if confirming a difficult stock market report, that the doctors said I had bleeding in my brain and that my back was broken. I corrected him, my voice still a rasp. It was fractured 2 vertebrae. An abyss of silence opened between us, filled with all the years of their denial and my silent suffering. The door opened again, and Ethan stood there. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by a timid, almost fearful hesitancy. When his eyes landed on me lying amidst the machinery that was keeping me stable, all the color drained from his face. He whispered my name, then the words that had been his shield his entire life. He whispered that he didn't mean to, that it was just supposed to be a joke. Something inside me, a core of rage that had been dormant for decades, ignited. It burned through the fog of pain medication and the weakness of my body. A joke, I repeated, my voice finding a new ragged strength. I asked him if it was a joke when he pushed me down the stairs when I was 7. I asked if it was a joke when he threw that baseball so hard at my ribs that it fractured them. I asked if it was a joke every single time he hurt me and they told me to stop being dramatic. He flinched, stepping back as if I had physically struck him. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. The familiar defensiveness returned to his voice as he insisted that he hadn't pushed me that hard, that I must have just lost my balance. At that moment, Dr. Chen returned, accompanied by a woman with a calm, steady presence who introduced herself as Sandra Davis, the hospital social worker. Doctor. Chen's eyes took in the scene, me tear-streaked and furious. My parents frozen in shock. Ethan defensive and cornered. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. She said she needed to discuss my MRI results with all of them. She pulled up the images on a tablet, a modern-day oracle revealing undeniable truths. She pointed to the current injuries first, the dark shadow of the bleed in my brain, the stark white lines of the fractures in my spine. My family stared, mesmerized and horrified. Then she switched the view. She highlighted the old healed calluses on 3 of my ribs. She zoomed in on the subtle, telltale line of a healed greenstick fracture on my left wrist. She explained, her voice devoid of emotion, that the injuries told a concerning story of repeated physical trauma over many years. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My father's face was a complete blank, a mask I recognized from my childhood that meant he was under extreme stress and about to shut down completely. It was Miss Davis who spoke next. She explained calmly that in cases like this, they were required by law to document and report patterns that suggested potential abuse. My father finally found his voice. He demanded to know what exactly they were implying. Miss Davis met his furious gaze without flinching. She said she wasn't implying anything. She was stating that his daughter had physical evidence of multiple traumatic injuries over many years, culminating in a life-threatening trauma that was left untreated for nearly 24 hours. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me, the living, breathing proof of their failure. Then my mother did something that broke the last fragile thread of hope I ever had for her. She turned not to me, not to the doctor, but to my brother. Her expression was a complex mixture of fear and fierce primal protection. Her voice was barely a whisper, a conspiratorial hiss directed solely at Ethan. She told him he had better call a lawyer. In that single moment, everything became clear. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It wasn't about my pain, my fear, or my near-death experience. It was about protecting Ethan. It was about protecting the family unit, the perfect image they had sold to the world. They were circling the wagons and I was on the outside. Left alone in the quiet of the room after they had been led away to speak with Miss Davis, I closed my eyes. The physical pain was a roaring fire, but for the first time a new sensation was beginning to bloom in its ashes: validation. The MRI hadn't just revealed broken bones, it had exposed a broken family. It had told the truth I had been trying to scream my entire life. My bones had a language of their own, and everyone finally was being forced to listen. The days that followed were a descent into a particular kind of hell reserved for the broken. Time dissolved into a monotonous cycle of pain medication, vital sign checks, and the disembodied, cheerful voices of nurses. I existed in a fog. My world shrunk to the 4 beige walls of my hospital room and the geography of my own shattered body. After a second lengthy surgery to stabilize my fractured spine with titanium rods and screws, I was fitted with a halo brace. It was a medieval-looking contraption, a metal ring screwed directly into my skull and attached by rods to a rigid vest. It was a cage for my head, a constant heavy reminder of my fragility and imprisonment. The pain was a living entity, a predator that stalked me even in my morphine-induced dreams. It was a deep grinding ache in my spine, a sharp electric fire that shot down my legs with any slight movement, and a relentless pounding headache that was the ghost of the bleed in my brain. My body, once a source of strength and independence, was now a traitorous landscape of nerve damage and atrophied muscle. The indignities were endless and profound. I, a successful, independent woman, could not sit up, could not feed myself, could not even use the bathroom without the assistance of strangers. Each time a nurse had to help me with the bedpan, a wave of hot, helpless shame washed over me. This was the peak of my suffering, not just the physical agony, but the utter annihilation of my dignity. Jenna, my rock, had flown in from San Francisco the moment she heard. She became my warrior, my advocate, my tether to the person I used to be. She washed my hair in a basin, read to me from novels when the words on the page swam before my eyes, and fiercely guarded my room from any unwanted intrusions. She was the one who told me my parents had tried to visit several times, but she had turned them away, telling them I was resting and not up to seeing anyone. I was grateful. I didn't have the strength to face their toxic blend of feigned concern and suffocating denial. My suffering, however, was a forge. In the crucible of pain and helplessness, a new, harder substance was being formed within me: resolve. My revenge would not be emotional or violent. I was beyond that. It would be cold, methodical, and absolute. It would be a simple, unwavering insistence on the truth. My family had built their entire world on a foundation of lies, with my silence as the mortar holding it all together. I was about to become a wrecking ball. The first step came a week into my hospital stay in the form of a Detective Miller. He was a tall, weary-looking man with kind eyes that had seen too much. He didn't treat me like a fragile victim or a dramatic woman. He treated me like a credible witness. Jenna sat in a chair by my bed, a silent, supportive presence as I gave my official statement. Speaking was difficult. The halo brace held my head rigid and my voice was still weak, but as I began to recount the events of that day on the dock, the words flowed with a chilling clarity. I described the taunts, the way Ethan blocked my path, the mocking bow, the deliberately wide toss of my sunglasses. I described the feeling of his presence behind me, his breath on my neck, and the force of the shove that sent me flying. Detective Miller listened patiently, his pen scratching across his notepad. He never interrupted, never questioned my perception. When I finished, he asked me about the historical injuries Dr. Chen had noted. A lump formed in my throat. I recounted the fall down the stairs at 7, the baseball to the ribs at 12, the countless other pranks and accidents that had punctuated my childhood. For the first time, I was telling my story to an agent of the law, to someone whose job it was to distinguish between truth and fiction. When he finally closed his notepad, he looked at me and told me he believed me. He explained that my statement, combined with the medical evidence and preliminary interviews with my cousins and Chloe, was more than enough to proceed. As he stood to leave, a profound sense of calm washed over me. The pain in my spine was still there, a roaring fire, but for a moment it was background noise. The act of being officially heard, of having my truth recorded in a police report, was a powerful anesthetic. It was the first small taste of satisfaction, a cool sip of water in the desert of my agony. My revenge had begun not with a bang, but with the quiet scratching of a pen. The second victory came 2 days later. Jenna arrived at the hospital with a determined look on her face and a newspaper tucked under her arm. She told me to prepare myself. Ethan Wallace, star athlete and golden child of the prominent Wallace family, had been arrested and charged with felony assault causing great bodily injury. His bail had been set at $250,000. I stared at her, the words echoing in the sterile room. arrested, charged. The system that my father had so masterfully navigated his entire life was now turning its cold, impartial gaze on his own son. I remembered being 10, locked in the basement closet, screaming until my throat was raw. When my parents finally found me, Ethan had received no punishment. I, however, had been grounded for a week for making such a fuss. Now, 2 decades later, an account was finally being rendered. I asked Jenna to read the article aloud. It was short, just a few paragraphs in the local section, but every word was a vindication. It mentioned the family vacation, the dispute on a dock, and the severe spinal and head injuries I had sustained. It was all there in black and white for the world to see. A small, fierce smile touched my lips. The pain in my head seemed to recede, replaced by a feeling of grim, righteous satisfaction. Their perfect family portrait now had a permanent ugly slash right through the middle of it. The suffering in my body was immense, but the knowledge of their public humiliation was a balm to my soul. The inevitable confrontation came a week after that. My parents, having posted Ethan's bail, requested a family meeting. My refusal to see them had clearly forced their hand. I agreed, but on my terms. The meeting would take place in a neutral conference room at the hospital. Jenna would be with me, and so would Sandra Davis, the social worker, acting as a neutral mediator. They arrived not as concerned parents, but as a corporate delegation on a damage control mission. They were accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as their attorney. My father was stiffly formal, his face a mask of controlled fury. My mother looked drawn and anxious, her eyes darting everywhere but at me sitting in a specially designed wheelchair, the halo brace a crown of thorns on my head. My mother spoke first, her words clearly rehearsed and stripped of all genuine emotion. She began by telling me they loved me very much and that they never meant for any of this to happen. She said they hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive the family and help them move past this unfortunate incident. The clinical detachment of her language, the family, this unfortunate incident, was like a slap in the face. It was the language of corporate press releases, not the language of a mother speaking to her catastrophically injured daughter. All the physical pain, all the sleepless nights, all the fear and humiliation I had endured was reduced to an unfortunate incident. This was the absolute peak of my emotional suffering. In that moment, I understood with chilling certainty that they were incapable of seeing me as a person. I was just a problem to be managed. My father then took over, shifting into his familiar, intimidating negotiation mode. He stated that they knew I was upset and that I had every right to be. But he explained pressing charges against my own brother would tear the family apart. He mentioned that Ethan was looking at serious jail time if this went forward. The threat was implicit: you are destroying this family. Then came the offer. He leaned forward, his eyes cold and calculating. He told me they were prepared to cover all of my medical expenses no matter the cost. He promised the best rehabilitation facilities, round-the-clock care, anything I needed. He said they would set up a trust fund for me that would ensure I never had to worry about money again. It was a king's ransom, an offer to buy my silence and my complicity. All he asked in return, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, was that I tell the prosecutor it was all a terrible accident, that I had slipped, and that I did not want to press charges against my brother. The audacity of it, the sheer transactional cruelty, took my breath away. They were trying to purchase my truth. They were putting a price tag on my pain. For a lifetime they had dismissed my suffering as worthless, and now when it threatened them, they were suddenly willing to pay millions to make it disappear. A strange thing happened then. The pain in my body, the crushing weight of the halo, the fire in my spine, it all seemed to fade into the background. It was replaced by an icy, diamond-hard clarity. For the first time in my life, I held all the power. Their perfect world, their reputation, their golden child's future, it all rested on my word. I let the silence stretch, watching the panic begin to flicker in my mother's eyes. Then I spoke, my voice low but steady, each word carefully chosen. I told them that their offer was noted. But I had a question. I slowly, deliberately recounted what Dr. Chen had told me. I explained that if Jenna hadn't called that ambulance when she did, I would likely have died from the brain bleed or been permanently paralyzed from the neck down within hours. I looked directly at my mother and asked her if she had known how serious it was when she accused me of ruining everyone's time and closed my bedroom door. My mother repeated her familiar, pathetic refrain that they didn't realize how serious it was. No, I corrected her, my voice rising with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I told her there was a difference. I told her that they hadn't just not realized, they had chosen not to believe me. I then turned to my father. I asked him what exactly they had ever done for me. I asked if ignoring my pain, dismissing my reality, and teaching me to distrust my own feelings were things for which I should be grateful. I would not lie about what happened, I stated. Ethan had pushed me deliberately just as he had hurt me countless times before. The only difference, I said, was that this time I had nearly died and there were medical records and a police file to prove it. My father's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of red. He accused me of repaying them for everything they had done for me by trying to send my brother to prison. I looked at this man who had terrorized me with his disapproval my entire life and felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. I told him quietly that they had been given so many chances to choose me, to protect me, to believe me. They had made their choice long before we ended up in this room. I then delivered the final blow. I told them that I would not be accepting their offer. I would be cooperating fully with the district attorney's office. I would tell the truth, the whole truth, on the witness stand if necessary. What the legal system did with that truth was not my concern. My only concern was that it would finally, for the first time, be told. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He hissed that I would regret this, that when our family name was dragged through the mud, I would regret choosing strangers over my own blood. They left defeated. The heavy oak door of the conference room closed behind them, shutting them out of my life in a way that felt more final than any physical distance ever could. I sat in my wheelchair, exhausted but buzzing with a triumphant electric energy. The pain in my spine was still a roar, but for the first time I felt a kind of freedom. I had faced my tormentors and had not backed down. I had rejected their money and their manipulation. The physical suffering was still my daily reality, but the emotional suffering of being their silent victim was over. And that feeling, that pure, unadulterated satisfaction, was worth more than any trust fund they could ever offer. The departure of my parents and their lawyer from that conference room left a vacuum, a ringing silence in which a new and formidable version of myself was born. The old Ava, the one who craved their approval and flinched from their disappointment, had died on that dock. The woman who remained encased in steel and plastic was a creature of pure, cold purpose. My suffering had reached its zenith in that room under the weight of their insulting offer. Now every action I took, every decision I made would be a step away from that peak, a calculated descent into the valley of retribution. My revenge would not be a wild, emotional rampage. It would be an architectural undertaking. My family had built a fortress of lies around themselves, buttressed by wealth and social standing. I would not try to storm the walls. Instead, I would meticulously dismantle their foundation stone by polished stone until the entire edifice collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. The first cornerstone of my plan was laid 2 days later. With Jenna's help, I retained the services of Eleanor Thorne, a civil litigation attorney with a reputation for being a smiling shark. During our first video conference with me propped up in my hospital bed, I saw not pity in her eyes but a keen strategic intelligence. I didn't want a bulldog. I wanted a grandmaster of chess, and I had found her. I explained that my goal was twofold. First, I wanted accountability for my physical and emotional damages. Second, and more importantly, I wanted to use the civil process as a weapon of discovery. My parents' greatest fear was exposure. The legal process of discovery would be my scalpel, allowing me to peel back the layers of their perfect life and expose the rot underneath. Miss Thorne understood immediately. She informed me that we wouldn't just be suing Ethan for assault. We would be suing my parents, Robert and Catherine Wallace, for negligence, for creating an environment where decades of abuse were enabled and ignored, culminating in a near-fatal incident. This was a critical escalation. It wasn't just about Ethan's single criminal act. It was about the entire system that produced him. The filing of that lawsuit was my first move on the chessboard. The moment Miss Thorne confirmed it was filed, a wave of profound satisfaction washed over me. It was a clean, intellectual pleasure, the feeling of a complex problem beginning to yield to a superior strategy. The constant throb in my head seemed to lessen, overshadowed by the thrill of the hunt. The second phase of my plan was to seize control of the narrative. I knew my parents would be working overtime, calling in favors, spinning a story to their influential friends in Philadelphia's high society. They would paint me as unstable, greedy, a troubled daughter lashing out. I had to strike first. I did not want to speak to the media myself. That would be messy and emotional, playing into their narrative of the hysterical daughter. Instead, Miss Thorne's office issued a formal press release. It was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. It began by acknowledging the deeply painful family matter that had become public. It then stated in stark clinical terms the nature of my injuries: a traumatic brain injury, requiring emergency surgery and complex spinal fractures necessitating multiple procedures and the implantation of titanium hardware. It announced the filing of the civil suit against not only Ethan Wallace but also Robert and Catherine Wallace for their role in the long-term pattern of behavior that led to this tragic and avoidable outcome. The final paragraph was the masterstroke. It stated that I intended to use a portion of any damages awarded to establish a foundation dedicated to providing legal and psychological support for adult survivors of family violence, particularly those whose experiences have been dismissed or denied by the people who should have protected them. With that single press release, I had reframed the entire story. I was no longer a vengeful daughter tearing her family apart. I was a survivor, a future philanthropist, an advocate for the silenced. Jenna read me the online comments as the story was picked up by local news outlets. The tide of public opinion, which might have been swayed by my family's influence, was turning decisively in my favor. Each supportive comment, each share of the article was a small victory that chipped away at my pain. The feeling was intoxicating. I was no longer a passive victim of their story. I was the author of my own. The third and most surgical strike was aimed directly at my father's heart, his career. Robert Wallace was a senior partner at a prestigious old-money Philadelphia law firm. His entire identity was built on his reputation as a man of integrity and power. I knew that a public scandal involving his immediate family, especially one with allegations of enabling abuse, would be radioactive within the firm's hallowed halls. Again, a direct emotional attack would be ineffective. I needed to present the situation not as a family squabble but as a business liability. With Jenna's help, we did our research. We identified the firm's 3 other managing partners. I didn't want to target the entire firm, just the men who held my father's fate in their hands. Jenna, acting on my instructions, assembled 3 identical packages. Inside each was a sleek professional folder. The contents were simple and devastating: a certified copy of the criminal complaint against Ethan Wallace, a copy of my civil suit against the entire family, and a copy of the press release issued by my attorney. There was no emotional letter from me, no plea for justice. There was only a single typed sheet of paper with a short, unsigned message. It read, "For your information and due diligence. This situation represents a significant and ongoing reputational risk." The packages were sent via a bonded courier, ensuring a signature upon delivery. We knew the moment they arrived. The satisfaction I felt was almost euphoric. I pictured the scene, the hushed, urgent meetings in mahogany-paneled boardrooms. I pictured the partners looking at my father not as a colleague but as a liability, a stain on their pristine reputation. I had bypassed my father entirely and made his professional life my battlefield. The physical pain I felt as I struggled through my first agonizing sessions of physical therapy that week was immense, but it was dwarfed by the mental image of my father being forced to explain himself to his peers. That thought was a more potent painkiller than any opiate. The results came faster than I could have hoped. First, a frantic, pleading phone call from a distant aunt, clearly dispatched by my mother, begging me to think about what this was doing to the family, to my father's health, to their standing in the community. Her panic was the sweet music of my success. Then came the call I was waiting for. It was my mother. Her voice was stripped of its usual condescending superiority. It was thin, reedy, and trembling with a desperation I had never heard before. She didn't bother with pretenses. She told me my father's firm had placed him on an indefinite leave of absence. She whispered that they were talking about invoking the morals clause in his partnership agreement to force him out. She said I was destroying him. I listened in silence, my heart beating a steady, triumphant rhythm. The halo brace felt less like a cage and more like a crown. She asked me what I wanted. She begged me to tell her what it would take to make this all stop. I took a moment before I answered, savoring the complete reversal of our lifelong power dynamic. Then, in a voice as calm and clear as a winter morning, I told her that I wanted nothing from her. I told her that this was no longer a negotiation. This was a process. It was a process of accountability she and my father had set in motion 30 years ago, and all I was doing now was seeing it through to its logical conclusion. Then I gently hung up the phone. That night, for the first time since the accident, I slept without nightmares. The pain was still my constant companion, a dull, aching reminder in my spine. But it was no longer the pain of a victim. It was the satisfying ache of a battle well fought. I had been broken, but from those broken pieces I was building a monument to the truth, and my family's ruin would be its foundation. The silence that followed my phone call with my mother was more profound than any shouting match we'd ever had. It was the silence of checkmate, the silence of a world ending. For weeks I had been the one on the defensive, the one reacting to their moves. Now the board was mine, and they were left with no pieces to play. Jenna became my window to the outside world, a grim but satisfying narrator of the Wallace family's implosion. She relayed information gleaned from mutual acquaintances, from whispers in the Philadelphia social circles that had once been my mother's kingdom, and from the increasingly frequent news alerts that pinged on her phone. Each update was a new chapter in their downfall and a dose of the strongest medicine for my soul. My mother, Catherine, was the first to truly break. Her entire existence was a performance, a carefully curated stage play of perfection. The set was her immaculate home, the script was her social calendar, and the audience was the city's elite. My lawsuit and the ensuing scandal had not just interrupted the play, it had set the entire theater on fire. A family friend, someone my mother had considered a confidant for over 20 years, called Jenna in a state of bewildered distress. She described a recent charity luncheon where my mother had been the guest of honor. But instead of fawning admiration, she was met with a wall of polite, icy distance. Women who once vied for her attention now offered tight, fleeting smiles and quickly moved away. Whispers followed her like a miasma. The friend recounted how my mother had tried to steer the conversation to her upcoming European vacation, but the room had fallen into an awkward, excruciating silence. She saw my mother's mask of composure begin to crack, her hand trembling as she lifted her water glass. For the first time, Catherine Wallace was not the queen of the social scene. She was the object of its pity and morbid curiosity. The friend told Jenna that my mother had left the event early, a thing she had never done. She had simply stood up, her face a pale, brittle mask, and walked out without a word to anyone. That image of my mother, the ultimate puppet master of appearances, fleeing her own stage in silent humiliation, was a masterpiece of retribution. I closed my eyes, picturing her retreat. The crushing weight of the halo brace on my skull felt for a moment like a victor's laurel. The constant grinding pain in my spine was a dull echo compared to the sharp, satisfying sting of her public shame. She who had been so concerned about a bloodstain on my jeans was now stained by a scandal she could never wash away. My father's unraveling was a quieter, but in many ways more devastating affair. Robert Wallace was a man built of authority and control. His identity was inextricably linked to his position at the firm, his corner office, his reputation as a legal titan. The indefinite leave of absence was a corporate euphemism for exile. He was a king without a kingdom. Jenna found an article in a local business journal. It was a small, discreet announcement about a restructuring in the senior partnership at his firm. My father's name was conspicuously absent. He had been erased. He hadn't been fired in a dramatic showdown. He had simply ceased to exist in the world that had defined him. Ethan's former football coach from high school, a man who had always remained in touch, reached out to a mutual friend. He had tried to call my father to offer support, only to have the call go to voicemail. He'd driven past the house and described it as looking like a mausoleum. The curtains were always drawn. The usually meticulously manicured lawn was starting to look neglected. He said the place felt haunted. I pictured my father, a man who thrived on a 60-hour work week and the cut and thrust of corporate law, now confined to that silent, darkened house. I imagined him sitting in his leather armchair, the television off, the phone, silent, with nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall to mark the passage of his empty days. He had spent his life dismissing my reality, and now his own had been stripped away. He was adrift in a sea of his own making, with no courtroom to command and no audience to impress. His power had been an illusion propped up by a title and a reputation I had methodically dismantled. The stillness of his ruin was the most eloquent justice I could have imagined, but the most profound collapse was Ethan's. My brother, the golden child, had never faced a single meaningful consequence in his entire life. Our parents had been his human shields, deflecting all blame, absorbing all impact. Now they were powerless, consumed by their own disgrace, and he was left to face the legal machine alone. His lawyer had arranged a meeting with the district attorney. It was supposed to be a proffer session, a chance for Ethan to tell his side of the story in the hopes of a favorable plea deal. According to a source Miss Thorne had within the DA's office, the meeting was a disaster. Ethan, accustomed to having his version of events accepted as gospel, had apparently walked in with a residual swagger. He started by telling the prosecutor that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, a prank that went wrong. He tried to paint me as emotionally unstable, prone to exaggeration. He was performing the role he had played his whole life, the charming, well-meaning jock whose little sister was just too sensitive. But he wasn't talking to our parents. He was talking to an assistant district attorney with a case file thick with evidence. The prosecutor calmly laid out the facts, the medical reports detailing the severity and pattern of my injuries, both new and old, the witness statements from Chloe and my cousins which corroborated my account of the shove, the police report, the press release from my lawyer. The ADA then, according to the source, looked Ethan in the eye and asked him to explain if it was just a prank how my previously healed rib fractures were consistent with his story. He asked Ethan to explain how my clumsiness resulted in a traumatic brain injury that nearly killed me. The source said it was like watching a balloon deflate. Ethan's bravado evaporated. He started to stammer to contradict himself. The familiar lines that had always worked on our parents were useless here. He was stripped bare, his lifelong narrative of harmless fun exposed as the violent fiction it truly was. He had no defense because the truth was indefensible. He left that meeting a different person. Chloe, his girlfriend, had broken up with him shortly after the arrest, and she had given a statement to the police that was deeply damaging. His friends, the ones who had cheered him on from the sidelines of football fields and life, had distanced themselves. He was alone, truly and completely alone for the first time. I imagined Ethan returning to that silent, darkened house facing the hollowed-out versions of our parents, the golden child tarnished and terrified. The two people who had spent his entire life convincing him he was infallible were now specters of failure, unable to protect him. The stillness in that house must have been deafening. It was the silence of people who have nothing left to say because all the lies have been exhausted. It was the silence of traitors sitting amongst the wreckage of the kingdom they had betrayed for a prince who had just been revealed as a common thug. Lying in my hospital bed, I traced the metal arch of the halo brace above my eyes. It was a cage, yes, but it was also a frame. Through it, I was seeing the world with a new, brutal clarity. The physical pain was a constant fire, but it was a clean fire burning away the last vestiges of the girl who had yearned for their love. In its place was a woman who found a colder, more lasting satisfaction in the quiet, complete, and utter stillness of their ruin. The day the halo brace came off was not the triumphant moment I had imagined. There was no soaring music, no sudden freedom. There was only the unnerving lightness of my own head, the raw, tender skin where the pins had been screwed into my skull, and the terrifying fragility of a neck that hadn't supported itself in months. The removal of the steel cage was simply the beginning of a different kind of imprisonment, the long, grueling work of rebuilding a body that felt like a stranger's. My days settled into a new monotonous rhythm, a landscape of physical therapy sessions and quiet, solitary afternoons. The architectural phase of my revenge was complete. The foundations of the House of Wallace had been shattered, and now all that was left was to watch the slow, inevitable collapse and reflect on the ruins. The fiery satisfaction of my initial victories had cooled, leaving behind a more complex and somber emotional landscape. The final act of the legal drama played out with a quiet, anticlimactic thud. Faced with the mountain of evidence and the prospect of a public trial that would air every piece of the family's dirty laundry, Ethan accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to felony assault. The golden child, the star quarterback, was now a convicted felon. Jenna attended the sentencing hearing on my behalf. She told me the courtroom was nearly empty. My parents were there looking like gray, faded photographs of their former selves. Ethan, she said, looked thin and broken. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood and in a voice barely above a whisper, he apologized. Not to the court, not to his parents, but to me, even though I wasn't there to hear it. He acknowledged that what he had done wasn't a prank, that he had hurt me and that he was sorry. Was it genuine remorse or the calculated performance of a man trying to lessen his sentence? I didn't know, and I realized with a startling sense of detachment that I didn't care. His apology, like my parents' love, had come too late to matter. His sentence was 3 years in a minimum security prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, followed by years of probation and mandatory anger management therapy. It was a slap on the wrist for nearly ending my life, but in a way the sentence was secondary. The true punishment was the public record, the indelible stain of the word felon that would follow him forever. The civil suit settled out of court shortly after. Miss Thorne negotiated a sum that was by any measure staggering. It was not a victory prize. It was the price of their betrayal, a number calculated to represent a lifetime of pain, future medical costs, and lost earning potential. When Miss Thorne called to tell me they had accepted the terms, I felt no elation. I felt only a profound, hollow weariness. The money was a tool, a means to an end. It would fund the foundation I had promised to create, and it would ensure that I would never again be dependent on anyone. But it could not mend a broken spine or erase 30 years of scars, both visible and invisible. It was during a quiet afternoon months later, as I was learning to walk again with the aid of a cane, that the final truth was revealed. The messenger was surprisingly my aunt, the same one who had called to plead on my family's behalf. This time her tone was not panicked but sad and confessional. She told me she had recently visited my mother. She had found her in the silent, darkened house sitting in the living room with a photo album open on her lap. My mother, in a moment of uncharacteristic vulnerability, had finally told the whole story. She confessed that from the moment I was born she had seen me not as a daughter but as a rival. I looked like my father's mother, a woman she had despised. I had an artistic talent she could neither understand nor control, unlike Ethan's easily quantifiable athletic achievements. The most devastating revelation was about my father. My aunt explained that my father's own father had been a cold, demanding man who had shown affection only when my father succeeded in sports. When Ethan was born, my father saw a chance to finally earn the approval he had never received from his own father vicariously through his son. He poured all his hopes and frustrated ambitions into Ethan. I, the quiet artistic daughter, was simply an inconvenient distraction from that all-consuming project. My oversensitivity, my drama, my pain, they had to be denied because to acknowledge their validity would be to acknowledge that their perfect project, their golden child, was flawed. It would force my father to see that he was repeating the same pattern of conditional damaging love he had endured. They didn't ignore my pain because they didn't see it. They ignored it because they could not see it without their entire world and their own self-conceptions crumbling. It was a betrayal far deeper than a simple shove. It was a betrayal of the very essence of parenthood. They had not been protecting Ethan from consequences. They had been protecting themselves from the truth. They had sacrificed my well-being on the altar of their own unresolved psychological damage. Hearing this didn't bring anger. It brought a strange, sad peace. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the explanation that allowed me to stop asking why their cruelty hadn't been about me at all. I was just collateral damage in a war they were fighting with their own ghosts. A year after the fall, I stood on my own 2 feet on the balcony of my new apartment in San Francisco overlooking the bay. The pain in my back was a dull, permanent ache, a physical barometer of my past. I would likely walk with a cane for the rest of my life. But as I watched the fog roll in over the Golden Gate Bridge, I felt a sense of stillness that was not the stillness of ruins but the stillness of acceptance. The greatest lesson I learned was that some betrayals are so absolute they are liberating. When the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor become the storm, you are forced to learn to build your own lighthouse. My revenge was not in their ruin but in my own survival and reconstruction. Their punishment was not a prison sentence or a lost fortune. It was the silent, empty house they were now forced to inhabit, a monument to a truth they could no longer deny. I had learned that truth has a weight, and for years I had carried it alone. Now the weight was distributed. It was in my father's forced retirement, in my mother's social exile, in my brother's prison cell, and in the titanium rods fused to my spine. They were all now forced to carry their share. I turned from the balcony and walked back inside my cane, tapping a steady rhythm on the hardwood floor. I was a different woman, scarred and altered, but whole in a way I had never been before. I had faced the very worst of the people who were supposed to love me most, and I had not only survived, I had prevailed. And in the quiet peace of my new life, I understood the ultimate truth. The most profound revenge is not to destroy your enemies, but to build a life so full of truth and purpose that their betrayal becomes nothing more than a footnote in F. Lee Blake, Your Own Triumphant Story.